Hello, hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone's the game. And today I'm going to be taking a look at the top 10 epic cards to craft in Hearthstone. Now, most players, when they're new to crafting and looking to craft a really cool card for their collection, will look towards a legendary. And that's fine, it's really nice to have a powerful legendary like Dr. Boom to add to a wide number of decks that gives you some nice average value across your entire collection. That can definitely help increase your average win rate. And I've already made a video covering the top 10 legendaries to craft for your collection. So I'll link that in the description, but sometimes you can actually get more value out of your collection if you add a handful of cheaper but just as powerful and impactful epic quality cards to your decks. So yes, one legendary is great, but it costs 1,600 dust to craft. It might not make your decks as better on average as 4 epics, which cost 400 dust each, because that can give you a higher number of cards to draw. So instead of relying on that Dr. Boom that will sometimes be at the end of your deck, you can get 4 pretty strong epics in its place that you'll be much more likely to draw throughout a game. So without further delay, let's go ahead and take a look at my top 10 epic cards to craft in Hearthstone. Now do keep in mind that I put a slight weight to neutral epic cards in this list. So in other words, cards that aren't a part of a class. Just because you can use those in more decks on average than you can with a class card. So for beginners who are looking to expand their collection, I think those will give you more value on average. But still, some class epics are so strong that they show up in almost every version of that class's decks. Or maybe are just the best card in slot for that class. So sometimes those epics will show up as well. So starting at number 10, we're actually going to go to Priests and a card called the Cobble Shadow Priest. This is a 6 mana 4/5 with a really strong battle cry. You can take control of an enemy minion that has 2 or less attack. This card shows up in most versions of Control Priest. It doesn't often show up in Dragon Priest, but even there, it could technically fit. In a meta where there are so many powerful 2 or less attack minions, it can really generate a ton of value for you. It can slow down opponents and help you build a board in one fell swoop. So it's great for Control Priests and really one of the best 6-drops in the game, I think. So don't underrate what a Cabal Shadow Priest can do for your deck. At number 9, we are actually going to go to the Warrior class, and a card called Shield Slam. This is only a 1-mana spell, so it might not look like it does a lot, but for Control Warriors, it's actually completely vital. You need cheap removal in Control Warrior to help you stabilize in the late game. So in other words, you can play a big minion and Shield Slam in a single turn. That way you can control your enemy's board while developing your own board full of threats. So cards like Shield Slam and Execute are absolutely vital to success in late game Control Warrior decks, and this one will show up in virtually every Control Warrior deck you've ever seen. And Control Warrior decks have been a staple in the metagame basically since the beginning of Hearthstone. So Shield Slam has been a card that's been played forever and seems like it will continue to be played for a very long time. So even though it's only 1 mana, it's still so impactful that it's worth crafting a pair of these if you ever intend to play a late game Control style Warrior deck. At the number 8 slot, we're going to head over to Shamans and actually craft I think the most iconic weapon in all of Warcraft. And that is Doomhammer. Shamans aren't always the most competitive class in Hearthstone, but if you ever intend to play Shaman, Doomhammers will typically show up, particularly in the hyper-aggressive Shaman decks that are very popular these days. Doomhammer is a staple and gives them the late game damage that they need to finish off games. It does 16 damage all on its own with base stats, but when you combine it with something like Rockbiter Weapon, it can go even crazier and hit for 10 or even 16 damage in a single turn as opposed to throughout the course of the entire weapon's duration. So Doomhammer is not only famous, but pretty important card for Shaman. If you ever want to play a Shaman deck well, Doomhammer is going to be a part of your list. At the number 7 slot, we are taking a look at Druids. And the Ancient of Lore, this 7 mana minion is a 5/5, and it gives you a choice. You can either draw 2 cards, which is what you'll be doing with it a vast majority of the time, but you can also restore 5 health. Ancient of Lore is just such a high value card that it shows up in virtually every druid deck ever, except maybe the most hyper aggressive druids. If it's a ramp style or combo style or mid-range druid, Ancient of Lore is going to be in the deck. The 5/5 body is great. The 2 cards are insanely good for the cost of this thing in general. So sometimes you'll also use the 5 health if you're desperately clinging to life against a really aggressive deck while looking for a combo to win. But Ancient of Lore is just so good and can do so many different things. And that's such a great body attached to it that the average value on this card is so high. It shows up everywhere. Ancient of Lore, that was our number 7 spot. Now heading to the number 6 spot is our first neutral epic card, and this is a Mountain Giant. This 12 mana bad boy is an 8/8, and it costs 1 less for each other card in your hand. So Mountain Giant is only popular really in a couple decks, namely like hand block style decks or some mage giant decks, which is the only reason it doesn't actually rank higher on this list since it is a neutral epic. But since it shows up in a couple decks and is one of the most recognizable and widely used epic cards, it still does earn its spot on this list. It's just such a strong tempo play if you can get it out on turn 4 or 5, and has really made Handlock a staple deck in the metagame for a very, very long time. So this thing, even though it's used a little less nowadays, does still show up in Handlock lists and variations on Handlock. So it earns its number 6 spot, mostly just on history, but also because it's still a very good card on average. The number 5 spot is a card which basically I could say the exact same thing for as the last one, and that is Molten Giant. This other giant is another 8/8, but this time it costs less for each damage your hero has taken as opposed to each card in your hand. It's played in the same exact kind of decks as Molten Giant, except it does show up a little more often in all kinds of Warlock late game decks, and also Giants Mages. It's a pivotal piece for Giants Mages who go down to 1 health and ice block and then play like 3 or 4 of these things in a single turn. So Molten Giant is slightly more played than Mountain Giant. Still not the most popular epic card in the world, but played often enough and neutral that it will show up for you in a deck from time to time. Now moving on to the number 4 spot. We're going to head back to Druids, and the card Force of Nature. This 6 mana spell summons 3 2/2 tree ants with charge that die at the end of the turn, and this is the first half of the famed Force of Nature plus Savage Roar combo that almost every Druid deck that's ever existed uses, because it is their ultimate finisher tool and the most reliable and consistent combo finisher in the entire game. So Savage Roar is a basic card that comes for free, but you want to build a strong Druid deck that relies on the combo, you will eventually have to craft this Force of Nature. So since it's so pivotal to the class and it shows up on the ladder constantly and has been a part of Hearthstone for a very, very long time, Force of Nature does crack the top 4. Now for the number 3 card, we're heading to another giant, but this one, even though it hasn't had the history of Molten Giant or Mountain Giant, lately it's becoming a far more consistent play on the ranked ladder, and it fits such a wide variety of decks that I think you're going to get more value out of it on average than the other 2 giants. That, of course, is Sea Giant. This is a 10 mana giant, still an 8/8, but it costs 1 less for each other minion on the battlefield. Lots of aggressive decks that are focused on building up the board, particularly like Zoo Warlocks or Shaman decks will play Sea Giant, just because it can go out as like a 4 mana 8/8 if you have lots of minions on the board. Sometimes it will even be like a 1 or 2 mana 8/8 in a particularly board heavy game where there's a lot of jostling of minions on board or a lot of cheap tokens. So you can develop a really cheap threat thanks to Sea Giant. And even if you don't have a deck or a collection full of a load of different legendaries and big bombs, Sea Giant can still kind of serve that role for only 400 dust. You can still get a big minion out in an otherwise cheap budget deck on the back of Sea Giant. So it's really good for budget or beginner players to add to their collection to give them some depth and a surprise bomb to finish off opponents who weren't expecting too much of it. Now for the number 2 spot, we're going to actually go to a class card, which seems weird, but Mysterious Challenger is a Paladin card that totally changed the meta at the release of the Grand Tournament, and still to this day in the League of Explorers era is controlling the meta. Secret Paladins have lost a little bit of popularity, but they haven't lost any potency. They're still one of the strongest decks on the ladder, and that's all thanks to this insane card. I don't think there is a single epic card in the set, the entire game of Hearthstone, that allows you to build a deck around it quite like Mysterious Challenger. If you get 2 of these, you're halfway home to a really strong Paladin deck that can play you to Legend and compete at the very highest levels of the game. So it doesn't take much to complement Mysterious Challenger. It's a lot of cheaper cards, and suddenly you have a very powerful deck. So that's the only card in this entire list, and really the whole game, that allows you to do that. And it is a 6 mana, 6/6, a really nice body with an insane battle cry. Put one of each secret from your deck into the battlefield. So this guy can play essentially 5 or 6 secrets in a single turn and allow you to deposit like 11 mana into play for only 6 mana. 11 mana worth of cards for 6 mana, which is just a huge tempo play. It's so hard to deal with. And even in super aggressive Paladin decks, this gives you the late game depth in a single card to finish off opponents, even though you played super greedy in the early game. So Mysterious Challenger, Secret Paladin decks are still insanely good, all thanks to this single card. And even though you can only play him in one class, he's so dominant and so powerful in that class that he earns the number 2 spot on this list of epic cards to craft. But still, it's not the number 1 epic card to craft. The number 1 epic card that every person will need is a Big Game Hunter. This guy is the answer to everything that's scary in Hearthstone. He is a 3 mana 4/2 with a battle cry, destroy a minion with an attack of 7 or more. Big Game Hunter is the ultimate Dr. Boom killer. He takes out all those giants. He's perfect for answering Mysterious Challengers that have been buffed. He belongs in almost every deck that's not a hyper-aggressive deck. So any mid-range or combo or control deck, you're going to see at least one Big Game Hunter to answer all the threats that your opponents have. He's just such a good tempo play, such a counter to people who play greedy decks, and still a solid body for 3 mana. That Big Game Hunter is just a fundamental part of Hearthstone. He shows up everywhere all the time. Sometimes you love it when you see him in your hand, and sometimes you hate it when the opponent has one. A lot of people think this card is kind of ruining the game just because it's such an easy and efficient answer to all the big threats out there, but it does help keep people in check, and if you have one of these in your collection, every deck you have is a little bit better against all the giant scary threats out there. So Big Game Hunter is far and away the most reliable and consistent and trustworthy epic card that you can craft in Hearthstone today. Don't miss out on this one. So there you have it. That's my list of the 10 best epic cards to craft in Hearthstone. Pick out your favorites, identify some classes that you like. If one of their cards showed up on this list, craft that bad boy. Save up your dust for a few strong epics, and I promise your decks will be better. Thanks so much for watching. Get out there and enjoy these cards. And until next time, game on.